I don't think anyone ever truly understood how quiet the world becomes after midnight until they've walked down a long, empty hallway with nothing but their own footsteps for company. That's what I remember most about that night, the silence. A silence so deep, so strange, that even the hum of the fluorescent lights sounded like a whisper. And in the middle of that stillness, long after the city had fallen asleep, a man stepped through the sliding glass doors of St. Matthew's Hospital, alone, unannounced, unnoticed. It was Ronald Reagan, not surrounded by Secret Service, not followed by cameras, not walking with the steady confidence he showed the world. Just a man in a heavy coat, shoulders slightly rounded, a softness in his eyes that told a different story from the one America thought it knew. The nurse at the night desk didn't even look up at first. She thought he was a visitor, maybe someone coming to check on a relative who couldn't sleep. It wasn't until he stepped closer, until his silhouette fell across her paperwork, that she glanced up and froze. She told me later that she almost didn't believe it was him. Presidents didn't walk into hospitals at 2 in the morning without warning. Presidents didn't walk anywhere alone, but he did. He gave her a small, apologetic smile, the kind of smile a man gives when he's interrupting something, even though he has every right to be there. He gently placed a hand on the counter, leaning in slightly, as if the act of asking for help was somehow a burden he didn't want to place on anyone. "I'm sorry to come at this hour," he said. His voice was soft. "I just need to see someone." The nurse stammered for a moment, caught between protocol and disbelief. No Secret Service, no call ahead, no escort. It didn't make sense. She finally managed to ask, "Mr. President, is everything all right? Do you need medical attention?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am. Someone else does." There was something in the way he said it, a weight, a quiet ache that told her not to ask more than he was willing to share. He wasn't there for a public matter, or a crisis, or some official obligation. He was there out of something far simpler and far deeper: compassion. He slid a small piece of paper toward her. A name was written on it. The nurse didn't recognize it, and she told me she felt almost embarrassed that she didn't. But Reagan only smiled softly and said, "I don't expect you to, but he's here, and I need to see him." Later, the nurse would describe the moment like this: "It was the first time I realized how human he was. He didn't walk in like a president. He walked in like a man who was carrying something in his heart." As she searched the records, Reagan stood quietly, hands folded in front of him, gaze drifting toward the dark hallway behind her. There was a loneliness about him that night, one that didn't fit the man the public knew, the man whose voice had once carried hope across a nation. He looked tired, not physically, but in a way that lives deep behind the eyes. When she found the name, her expression changed slightly. She looked up at him. He noticed. "He's in the critical wing," she said carefully. Reagan nodded once, not with fear or surprise, just a soft acceptance, as if he already knew. He thanked hurriedly, thanked her with sincerity, and then walked past the desk, down the dim hallway. She didn't call security. She didn't alert anyone. Something in her understood that whatever had brought him there, it wasn't something to be interrupted. The hallway was lit by those cold overhead lights hospitals always use, the kind that strip color from everything. And yet, as he walked, the scene felt warm somehow. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, quiet gentleness rarely seen in leaders. Or maybe it was the way he slowed down at each door he passed, glancing inside without intruding, like someone who knew the weight of human fragility. I only learned later that the man he was visiting was someone from early in his life, a private part of his past, tucked away in the years before fame, before Hollywood, before politics. Not a family member, not a public figure, someone who existed in the quiet chapters of his biography, the ones rarely mentioned. He stopped outside room 214. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door, gently, as though afraid of letting too much light into the room. The glow of the hallway spilled onto the floor, stretching toward the small, dim lamp beside the bed, and there, lying motionless beneath a thin blanket, was an older man with a frail chest and shallow breaths. Reagan stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. No cameras captured what happened next. No reporters wrote it down. No aides ever mentioned it. But the nurse who passed by at that moment saw enough to retell it years later. Reagan pulled a chair up to the bedside. Slowly, silently, he sat down with a heaviness that didn't show on his face but lived in the way his shoulders shifted slightly forward. He rested his hands on his knees for a moment, as if grounding himself, then leaned closer to the man. "Hey there," he whispered. The man didn't respond. Reagan reached out and placed his hand gently over the man's frail hand, and in that simple gesture, something in the room changed. The air, the tension, the sadness. It was as if the years between them collapsed into a quiet acknowledgement of shared history. "You probably don't know I'm here," he said, voice barely above a breath, "but I needed to come." He swallowed, his throat tightening slightly. "There are things I never said, things I should have said, and I'm sorry it took me this long." The man didn't move. Machines hummed quietly. A faint beep marked each shallow breath. "You were good to me," Reagan continued, "better than I deserved at the time." That was when he paused, a long, trembling pause. The nurse swore she saw the shine of tears in his eyes, tears that never quite fell, but were there all the same. "I should have come sooner," he whispered. "I hope you know that." There was a tenderness in his voice, unlike anything the world had ever heard from him. It wasn't the voice of a president. It wasn't the voice of an actor. It was the voice of a man confronting a memory he had carried in silence for far too long. He leaned back slightly, letting out a slow, unsteady breath. "You changed me," he said, "more than you ever knew." That was when something unexpected happened. The man's hand twitched barely, faintly. Reagan froze. The man's eyelids fluttered, just enough that Reagan leaned in, hopeful but afraid to hope too much. And the nurse, who saw from the doorway, said that what happened next was one of the most heartbreaking and beautiful things she'd ever witnessed. Reagan squeezed his hand gently, his voice cracking just slightly as he whispered, "It's all right, I'm here now." The old man's lips parted just enough to let out the faintest sound so weak it was almost a breath. But Reagan heard it. Ronnie, the way he reacted, the tremble in his shoulders, the way he bowed his head for a moment, that told everything. Who was this man? What did he mean to Reagan? Why had Reagan carried this guilt for so long? All those questions would unfold in the second part of the story. Because that night in the hospital wasn't just a visit. It was a reckoning, a memory resurfacing, a wound reopening, and, in its own quiet way, a goodbye. The rest of the story is what happened after that first whispered word. A word Reagan hadn't heard spoken in decades. And that's where the second part begins. For a moment after the old man whispered Ronnie, the room fell into a stillness so deep it felt like even the machines paused to listen. Reagan leaned forward, his breath catching as though that single word had reached into a part of him he had kept shut for decades. His eyes shimmered with something raw, ignition, relief, and a sorrow that had been waiting quietly in the corners of his memory. He squeezed the man's hand with both of his, gently but firmly, grounding himself in the fragile warmth of that moment. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm right here." The man's eyes fluttered open just enough to reveal a faint, tired glimmer like embers of a fire long burned down but still alive. He tried to speak again, but his words dissolved into a soft rasp. Reagan leaned in even closer, bending his ear toward the trembling lips, giving every ounce of his attention to a voice he feared he might never hear again. "You came back," the man breathed, barely audible. Reagan's shoulders dropped as if a long-carried weight had finally found the floor. Double quotes, "Yes," he answered. "I'm sorry it took me so long." The man blinked slowly, the corners of his eyes wet. There was something in that expression, something between forgiveness and farewell that softened Reagan's face in a way almost no one had ever seen. In that dimly lit hospital room, he wasn't a president, or an icon, or a public figure. He was simply a sun-like figure speaking to the person who had quietly shaped him more than anyone ever knew. "Didn't think you'd remember," the man whispered. Reagan swallowed hard. "I never forgot," he said. "Not a single day." He reached up and gently brushed the side of the man's blanket, tightening it around his shoulders with the same careful tenderness someone would use for a child. He sat back down, keeping their hands locked together. And then, the real story behind the night began to unfold. "You know," Reagan said softly, "people always ask what taught me to believe in second chances. They think it was the movies, or the speeches, or being raised in the Midwest. But it wasn't any of that. It was you." The man's breathing grew uneven, but he kept his gaze fixed on Reagan with a stubborn determination. "You always had it in you," he murmured. Reagan shook his head gently. "No, that's not true. I wasn't the kid people think I was. I was angry, impatient. I got into trouble more times than I'd like to admit. And you were the one who pulled me out of it. You're the reason I became anything at all." The man's lips pulled into the faintest smile. "You were a good boy. Lost, maybe, but good." Reagan lowered his head, overcome for a moment. When he lifted it again, there was a quiet strength in his eyes that seemed to steady the room. "You saved me the night you sat with me on those steps," Reagan said. "All those years ago, you didn't say a word. You didn't have to. Just sitting there. It changed the direction of everything." The old man tried to nod, though even the smallest movement looked like it took effort. "You were hurting," he said, "and you didn't let me stay alone," Reagan replied. A long silence followed, not uncomfortable, just full of shared history, of years unspoken, of all the things life had pushed between them. Reagan leaned back in the chair, still holding the man's hand, as if afraid to break the fragile connection between them. "You know," Reagan said after a while, "when people ask who inspired me, I never know how to answer. They expect me to say a president, or an actor, or some world leader, and I always smile, because the truth is, the person who changed me most was a man who never asked for credit." The old man's eyes filled with emotion, not pride, exactly, but something deeper, something like peace. "You did well, Ronnie," he whispered. Reagan let out a shaky breath. "I tried," he said. "God knows I tried, but I also made mistakes. Big ones, and I carried them longer than I should have." The man stared at him gently. "You learned," he said. "That's what matters." Reagan closed his eyes for a moment, letting those words settle into him. Words he didn't know he still needed. Words that felt like the ending to a chapter he had left unfinished. When he opened his eyes again, he spoke with the softness of someone sharing a truth he'd kept hidden, even from himself. "I should have visited sooner," Reagan said. "I told myself I was too busy, that life had gotten complicated. But the truth is, I was afraid." The man squeezed his hand, barely but noticeably. "Afraid of what?" he murmured. Reagan hesitated. "That you wouldn't remember me," he said. "Or worse, that you would—" The man let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, soft and tired. "I always remembered," he whispered. It was then that Reagan leaned forward again, bringing his other hand over the man's fragile fingers. The pale hospital light fell across his face in a way that revealed every line of age, every shadow of memory, and every quiet ache he had never shown the world. "You were there for me," he said, "and I should have been there for you." The man closed his eyes, as though gathering what little strength he had left. "You're here now," he said. Reagan nodded, his voice trembling. "I am," he whispered, "and I won't leave." Minutes passed in silence, the kind of silence two people can share only after a lifetime of unfinished words. Reagan sat with him, steady and present, until the man's breathing grew softer, slower, more fragile than before. A faint alarm blinked on one of the machines, but Reagan didn't flinch. He simply tightened his grip, gently but firmly, though the man's eyes drifted open one last time. "Proud of you," he managed to say. Reagan bowed his head until his forehead nearly touched their joined hands. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." The man's breathing steadied for a moment. One last peaceful rise and fall, and then it stopped. The line on the monitor flattened. The room fell so quiet that even the hum of the hallway disappeared. Reagan didn't move. He didn't call for a nurse. He didn't panic. He didn't wipe the tears that finally fell. He simply held the man's hand, gently, respectfully, as the weight of goodbye settled into the air like dust. The nurse eventually stepped inside, her eyes soft with understanding. Reagan looked up at her, not as a president requesting help, but as a man asking for a moment longer. "Just give me a minute," he said. She nodded and stepped back quietly, closing the door without a sound. Reagan sat there for a long time, long enough for the tears to dry on his cheeks, long enough for the heaviness in his chest to shift into something quieter, something resembling acceptance. Eventually, he stood up slowly, releasing the man's hand with the tenderness of someone parting with a sacred memory. He leaned down and brushed a hand gently across the man's shoulder, straightening the blanket one last time. "Goodbye," he whispered, "and thank you for saving me when I needed it most." He stepped out of the room, leaving behind not just an old friend, but the final piece of a story he had carried silently for most of his life. The hallway seemed even longer now, the lights slightly dimmer, the quiet somehow deeper. He walked past the nurse's station and paused just long enough to give her a grateful nod. "Take good care of him," he said softly. "We will, Mr. President," she replied. He smiled at her, not the polished smile the public knew, but a small, tired one that held gratitude and grief in equal measure. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, his figure growing smaller beneath the humming lights. When the sliding doors opened, a cold breeze swept in from the quiet night outside. He pulled his coat tighter around himself and stepped into the darkness. No cameras, no security, no entourage, just a man walking through the night with memories heavier than the winter air. No one outside knew where he had been. No one asked. No one needed to. Some stories, the ones that shape a man's soul, are meant to live only in the quiet. And that night, as he disappeared into the stillness of the early morning, Ronald Reagan carried with him something gentler, something heavier, something deeply human, a final goodbye to the man who taught him how not to give up on himself. If this story touched you, even in a small way, I'd be grateful if you stayed with us. There are more quiet moments, more forgotten memories, and more stories from Reagan's life waiting to be told. If you'd like to hear them, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel. Your voice helps keep these stories alive. Thank you for being here.